Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I wanted to come back to the same issue that is under discussion by a good many people in different sectors of society. And that is the issue of the impact of COVID-19 on our economic situation and on people in general. But I wanted to address in specific the problem of food shortages and the problem of people overall trying to figure out how they're going to function. There's been a number of different reports that have been issued for about a month now with regard to the supply chain of goods, specific food, and the issue is nothing new. It's been analyzed for about a month, as I said, and a half, and now the media is beginning to slowly release various statements with regard to the issue that's coming up with the supply chain. And we're somewhat being prepped for the fact that there's going to be problems with food arriving. That doesn't mean that there's problems with food production in and of itself. There's some things to be noted here. First of all, there was an overabundance of certain types of foods. Even those foods were destroyed. And now there's critiques being waged at the Trump administration and the USDA for the fact that there was so much food that was destroyed. But countries across the world were depending upon labor to be able to deal with the issue of the supply chain. And that labor was stopped. So it's not that there's like some sort of famine that plagued the world globally, and that's why they're talking about disruption in the supply chain. That's not the issue. The issue came back to the labor force not being in place to be able to transport food properly. Even the issue of gas is not because there's no gas. There's actually an overabundance of gas, and gas prices were going pretty cheap. So the crisis that we're facing, a lot of it is mismanagement, and a lot of it has to do with the disease threat and so on and so forth, and immigration laws. There's a number of different things that have to be analyzed here. One of the most problematic things that I find in this whole COVID-19 crisis and the economic fallout, because they're interrelated but they're two different things. You have to realize that we're confronting a crisis of capitalism, and that's something that's not talked about. And economists were already predicting an economic downturn. They were already talking about that at some point in time, the economy was going to plunge. And you have to realize people are making big money here. The amount of billionaires that have been produced is a large amount, but at the same time, there's a shrinking of the middle class and an expansion of the poor. And so it's not that money is not being made either. It's that the system of justice is not in place to be able to distribute to people in an equitable fashion. Doesn't have to always be everybody gets the same thing, but distribute wealth in an equitable fashion is not in place. All that aside, look, at the end of the day, we're not going to get anywhere with a panic mode. And unfortunately, that's how the media has been presenting a lot of issues that pertain to the COVID. Everything has been panic mode. People need to realize that they need to organize themselves, or else you're going to be very messed up. There's no other way to put it. You're going to be in a very, very bad situation. Because even if you're okay economically, psychologically, you're going to need the support to be able to manage, what is going on. But when we start talking about food shortages and all of that, we need to be able to come up with our own solutions. And up to this point, that's something that is very important. We may need to push for the changing of zoning laws. We may need to push for, more localized projects. We may need to push for, let's go back to the zoning law issue, to be able to have animals, to be able to use certain buildings for growing projects that maybe it was not, within the legal system's permission or whatever. But we need to have a collective type of mindset that is not threatening to the culture, so to speak. And so you can't necessarily just jump to some sort of communist solution or whatever, but you're going to have a modified way of dealing with this, and there's going to have to be a cultural change. People are going to have to think about each other. There's many people that don't have a support system, and that's the reality. This is the only way that we're going to be able to move with this situation as it is. We have not begun to feel the real impact because we're isolated, because there are certain paddings that are there right now. But, globally, when you analyze, the impact is being felt in different ways. If you look at some places right now, the protests are emerging, and if you look in other places, the repression is very clear. And so, what I mean by that is people already are starting, in some places, they're already starting to come out and protest. And I'm even talking about globally even. They're already starting to protest the situation as it is and organize themselves in the way that they can. And then in other situations, you see repression. You see that there's more brutality. You see there's more issues that are coming about. And so that's why it's not good for us to fail to think about solutions. It's not good for us to be in that mode of we wait till it hits us, then all of a sudden we panic and we're all over the place. This is a time period where people have to orient themselves and see how they can take care of themselves, their families, and, within their communities. And so there's solutions that are out there. But now is going to be a point of identifying who can make these things happen and how it is that we can organize ourselves to facilitate the effect or the impact of this crisis. You have to think that, how can we organize, how can we function, how can we facilitate for each other as well? Because people are going through a lot of different circumstances and situations which are very heavy to handle psychologically. So, we have to be honest with ourselves from the angle of what is it that we can contribute, and and we have to be honest with ourselves with regard to our limitations. And we also have to, be considerate of each other, and we also have to realize that we have to push each other and we need each other. And this is not just going to be with people in our local circles. We need to even be thinking nationally. We need to be thinking globally. How can we come up with solutions to the crisis that's about to hit the world, which is basically the crisis of poverty, the issue of food. With the destruction of so much food within the U.S., there's a possibility that it may make the food prices go up. We have to pay attention to the logistics. Get off of the regular media. Go into business analysis. Go into logistic analysis. Look at how analysts are looking at the different sectors of the economy. Whether it's labor or whether it's petroleum or whether it's food supply. Look at other countries as well. What's going on for a while? Germany was having deep issues because their labor pool, which usually comes from Eastern Europe, it wasn't mobile. And so that created a problem with the farming for them, with the agricultural sector. And so when you see those types of things that kind of put you ahead, where you can have an analysis of what was going on, in the Dominican Republic, you began to see, there was some repression because people refused to have any type of social distancing. And there was a social distancing law that came in place. And, basically, the police became harsh. And there's other issues as well with regard to when these social distancing rules came into place, were people able to afford, in other words, did they have the economic means to be able to do what it was that they were being told to do for the common well-being. So some people couldn't afford to stay home, so that forced them to be in a situation where they had to go and seek out how they're going to live. In other words, go make money. And so that creates a problem when you have that type of policy being put in place, but the people are not being taken care of. So you begin to see, how are these policies in place, but there's no people, it's not people focused, it's not people centered. And so that gives you an idea also of things that are going on here. And so the biggest issue that we're going to face, people, is going to be with furloughs and unemployment and lack of employment. Supposedly with furloughs and unemployment, you have money coming in. But we've seen the logistical nightmare of that, with people filing for unemployment and not necessarily getting money. And we don't really know what the furlough thing is going to entail. If a corporation may play the scam move, you know what I'm saying? It may say, yeah, we'll pay you, but then go, disappear from the paper, so to speak. And so with that, with the unemployment and the furlough and the lack of employment for the people that are not working within those systems, there's an issue with rent and there's an issue with mortgage. And so we may, and don't want to be alarmist, but we have to be smart. We may be facing a shelter crisis, and if we're facing a shelter crisis, that means that people are going to be struggling to look for a place to stay. And in addition, and we already know all of this because it was mentioned in the media, with people losing their jobs and so on and so forth, you have people without health care. And so we have a compounded health care crisis. And you have to realize that hospitals are built on the business model. And so we may see hospitals closing, and in some places, that's the model that we're seeing. We're seeing that the hospitals are closing, emergency rooms are closing, hospitals are closing. Again, we're looking at things from a global perspective, a national perspective, and a local perspective. So then that means that if you have family that needs medical attention, you have to be aware of these types of changes that are taking place, because your accessibility is not going to be the same. And those who have family, or they themselves are suffering medical conditions, they already know that a lot of things have moved to telemedicine. And what is happening in some places with the telemedicine is that they're so backed up that they're beginning to what? They're beginning to tell people, well, wait, we have to reassign your appointment. And so people are staying without medical attention. And this is one of the reasons why we had said in other lives, part of organizing ourselves is identifying who we can go to outside of the hospital establishment. What people do we know that are doctors, that may be able to write prescriptions, that may be able, or nurses, that may be able to assist us. This is where it's at. And this is the situation for people, that you have to realize one of the benefits of doing relief work is when you see systemic collapse because of a natural disaster, there's certain things that are no longer in place, which one of them is food supply goes out. The issue of security is a problem. The issue of medicine is a problem. And unfortunately, the issue of power becomes a problem. We're hoping that it doesn't get to some of those extremes because of the economic issues. But already 2008, we can see 2007, 2008. Forget about the Great Depression, because many of us didn't live that, unless you're going to be talking to people who lived through that to kind of get an experience of how they dealt with that. And most of it, there's, personalized experience, there's studies, there's even like videos and stuff like that, and people work together. Actually, let's pause on the Great Depression. Families work together. Families moved in with each other. People began to have less. There was solutions that people made as groups. That's just the reality. That's how they survived a lot of that. They economized on every front. And so that is a situation which people are going to have to learn how to deal with. It's going to be a shock for many people if they have to go through these changes. because they're used to having large amounts of space for themselves. They're used to the world being about them. And then when you're put in these situations where you have to depend upon each other, it's not about what you want. And that's where, if communication is not good, if there's emotional issues, if there's clashes, all of that stuff comes to the fore as a problem to us, working together. But in any event, we're going to have to look at how we think about things, how we, value things, and, our lifestyle decisions. But we have to change to the collective model. We have to change to the collective model before it becomes a real serious problem. And it's better to think and organize about what solutions are in the case of these things versus having a panic mode. And the more of us that we have these types of discussions, the more that you have, assistance to the system from the angle of, you have grassroots efforts. And I'm not talking about, necessarily the protest model or this or that. I'm just saying you have grassroots efforts of communities already self-organizing, already coming up with solutions as to, what it is that could be done to alleviate the impact of this thing on our lives. And it's going to come. It's unfortunate, but it's going to come. You can't reboot a system immediately in 2 months that has pretty much collapsed on multiple levels. With the massive unemployment, that's not the situation. It's just not going to reboot itself overnight. We still don't know who's gone forever from business and who's going to be shutting down soon, even though they're pretending they're going to help. And we don't know what kind of, alternatives can be put in place. But the reality is that Washington doesn't have its stuff together in terms of leadership of this country. And, we need to be pushing for an FDR type of legislation, a New Deal type of legislation, and they're just against it. And if we have another 4 years of Trump, what we're going to see is the business sector dominate, and just the same way that they dominated when it came to the 2007-2008 economic crisis. And also we may have to orient ourselves to do business, and this is where working with each other becomes important, because job security is definitely going to be something that's going to go out the door for a lot of people. Already in Puerto Rico, protests already have begun, and the month has not even kicked off. The new month has not kicked off, which May 1st, there was an announced, national strike for workers. There's also a strike that's being organized, a rent strike, a mortgage strike, and so people are organizing on those types of fronts. But at the end of the day, the protest model by itself is not going to help us go anywhere as far as a practical solution. The rent strike and the mortgage strike has legitimacy, but at the same time, it will be better if, like what Ilhan Omar said, if the government was able to address the situation of the landlords. Because then if you don't have income coming into some of these, especially smaller establishments, the massive management companies is a different issue completely. But some of these, like some people own a home and that's how they make money off of it because they rent it. If you don't have income coming to these people, it's the same problem all over again. You have the middle class, which is basically, you might as well say 500,000 on down, and if you have, that group being impacted heavily economically, you still don't have a solution. And so protest is one thing, but protest should come with clarity of what we want. It should not just be protest for the sake of protest knowing exactly what we want. But, the issue of coming up with tangible solutions which will allow us to stabilize our communities and our families and so on and so forth is way much better in terms of how we, should be using our energy. And there's safety in numbers, to be honest with you, to a certain extent. If those people that you're with are people that really want to grow. If not, this is just going to turn into the issue of individually, people individually coming up with solutions and clashing with each other in a survival of the fittest type of ethic. And really, with an environment like this, where so many people went and bought guns and all of this type of stuff, we really don't want that type of environment. And there was a report that needs to be authenticated, which was saying that there was about 100 of these types of groups that kind of want to see war and all of that they were utilizing social media. Again, that report needs to be verified, but it's a problem. And then when you have people in the streets without employment, and they're used to engaging in criminal activity, when their money sources dry up, it's a problem. So that's why we say that the more that we can think, as in light of community well-being, the better that it will be, and the easier that it will be. And and don't think that it's going to always come from your family, and don't think that it's always going to come from your religious community, because they may not. So you need to align yourself with people that are interested in really seeing humanity move forward. That's something that's important. And we leave on that note. Have a psychology of solutions. You're going to have to project yourself into the future. Get off of the whole what's happening now. And you're going to have to go through the stress of the scenarios of what that means if things don't work out too well. You're going to have to, don't obsess with it, because it can create issues, but you have to have that mindset of kind of looking to the future with the information that you have. What are some possibilities of how this thing is playing itself out? And then that way we can, as a community overall, have discussions on how we can address issues. But putting on the blinders and just looking at the moment and letting everything just fall in its place is not a solution. That may be a coping strategy, but it's not a solution-oriented approach, right? And so I advise people, at the very small level, think about your family, what you can do and how you can cooperate. And then, you expand out as much as possible. And family doesn't necessarily mean blood ties. It can mean at this point, people that you have a loving relationship with, and you take care of each other, and so on and so forth. And it's serious, people. It's unfortunate. We don't want to be alarmist, but the situation is serious. And the mismanagement of this situation, is something that you can't allow to have an impact on you as much as possible. And right now there's time to kind of think through things. But, when the check doesn't come for people, or for instance, you're being evicted out, people say, oh, you can't be evicted out. Well, let's wait and see how this stuff plays out. There's no legislation protecting people. You know what I'm saying? So there's no legislation saying that you can't evict people. There's no legislation saying that the sheriff is going to be stopped. Let me tell you something. 2007, 2008, old ladies were being put on the street. They were being taken out of their homes that they've been in for years, all their lives, and they were put out on the street. And that was a basic indication, unfortunately, of how our society dealt with the crisis model and real life situation. And that was a small situation in comparison to what we're facing now. So I leave on that note. Identify where the resources are. Try to see who you can align with, and be proactive. Assalamu alaikum.